Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for your patience as we sort out the seating situation and the food. I hope everyone got a bite to eat. I'm Bobby Chesney. I'm the James Baker Chair at UT School of Law and Director of UT's Strauss Center for International Security and Law, as well as an affiliated scholar of the Clements Center for National Security, directed by my colleague, Dr. Huaiyin. And on behalf of Will, the Strauss and Clements Centers are co-sponsoring this event today, and I must say we're especially excited to do so. A key priority for both centers is to help the students at UT and the larger public better understand the issues and complexities that arise with the growth of and expansion of the Chinese role in the world. And as part of that, one of our favorite colleagues, Professor Josh Eisenman, who's here in the middle of the table, is someone who's really central to both our programs, and we're very excited about the opportunity to spotlight his work today. Josh's work focuses on Chinese politics and foreign relations, including with the United States and with the developing world, Africa in particular. He has just published a separate book from the one we're going to talk about today, Red China's Green Revolution. But, you know, why publish one book when you can publish two? So at the exact same time, he has also got forthcoming the book we're here to celebrate today, China Steps Out, Beijing's Major Power Engagement with the Developing World, where Josh is the co-editor along with MIT's Eric Hegenbotham, and also the author of the chapter in the book on Africa. And I just want to underscore for those who are not faculty and don't necessarily appreciate for an associate professor to simultaneously produce a major book of his own and at the same time to be the co-editor of an influential and important book like this, and a contributor of a chapter in it. It's a heck of an achievement, although I can't say I'm actually surprised at all because Josh is an immensely productive and capable scholar. So in keeping with the larger UT tradition of celebrating important book publications, thank you for joining us today for this. And I should single out our two commentators for joining us today. We're very happy to have these two other members of our extended family with us. We have the State Department's diplomat in residence at UT, Julie Kavanagh. I could go on and on about your accomplishments in diplomacy and in service of our country over the years. I will simply highlight that most recently you were is the proper title Minister Counselor? Minister Counselor for Consular Affairs at the Embassy in Beijing, responsible for consular operations in general, policy matters throughout China, and then for a time towards the end of that mission, serving as the acting deputy chief of mission for the U.S. mission to China. So really remarkable that you did that right before coming to Texas. So you went right from one rising global power to another rising global power in China. That's quite a combo. And second, our colleague, Dr. Huaiyin Lee, director of today's other co-sponsor, the Center for East Asian Studies here at UT, and also, of course, professor of history and Asian studies, and also, of course, a distinguished scholar affiliated with our programs. So we're so pleased you both were here to help us celebrate Josh's work and to share your observations on the book itself. The book is China Steps Out. Josh will be signing it beginning at 1:30, so that is when we'll leave. There'll be a table set up outside. I think, is that right, just down the hall there? So be sure and go out there and get Josh's autograph. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Josh to give some opening comments about the book. And then Dr. Lee and Ms. Kavanagh will give their comments, and we're going to make sure to save time for you to offer your questions and observations. So be thinking all along about what you'd like to ask about. Again, thanks for being here. Josh, congratulations on a heck of an achievement. Thanks so much.
Well, thanks so much, Bobby. It's really great to be here, and I'm so happy to see so many people here. This is really great. And at the risk of sounding like, you know, an Oscar acceptance speech, every edited volume has a lot of contributors to it. So you'll pardon me if I just recognize a few people who have been really essential in getting this book forward. First, of course, I want to recognize my co-panelists and commentators here. You know, LBJ is a policy school, right? So we do policy and we do school. And so here we have policy and here we have school. So it's very appropriate that these two would be here to comment on this book from different perspectives. So thank you very much. Certainly I want to thank the Strauss Center. I want to thank, you know, of course, Bobby, Anne, Ashley, Jean, and others who have been so supportive of me since I've been here. So thank you. And of course the Clements Center, Willem Bowden, Paul, where's Paul? Paul, somewhere around. Yeah, there he is. Okay, behind. Okay. and the Clements Center people. So, it's been so fantastic to have so much institutional support. Of course, the Center for East Asian Studies, so the trifecta. And it really goes to show this is a research institution and we have so much great scholarship going on, so many great centers, and I want to call attention to them. As a co-editor of the book, I also want to recognize Sarah Kaiser Cross, who's a graduate of the LBJ School, and it was her MA thesis which became the basis for her chapter in this book. So being able to include students from the LBJ School and other people in the process, to me, that was really a special part of this book. And I would commend her chapter to you because I would say it's probably the best thing you can read on China-Arab relations. And of course, all of us should always thank our research assistants, right? Because without them, there's no way that the data would have been put together, and the data is such a fundamental part of this book. Because what I did was, in a draconian fashion, I insisted that all of the people contributing use the same data sets, right? Not go pulling from press accounts here and there to make a point, but to all use authoritative data sets. And that's simply not possible without the research assistants that I had, who are all LBJ students, Lo Siyu, Gumahan, and Misayi. Their efforts were really essential to this project. So, with all of that out of the way, let me kind of jump into this. And rather than summarize the points of the book, what I'm going to do is just put a few issues up on the table, issues that I have concerns about, issues that are kind of related to this book, and then turn to my colleagues for some comments. Let me start, if I might, with something that academics do rarely, which is modesty. American sinologists got China really wrong. And this is a theme you're going to see a lot, if you're not already seeing it in the literature. And I would say that, about 10 years ago, when I was on Capitol Hill, a young single guy, working my ass off, there were three main views about China. The first was what James Mann called the soothing scenario, that China would, over time, gradually become a liberal, democratic country. This was advocated by many people. Bill Clinton even made comments about it. It was a very well-accepted theme. The second was that China would simply continue to muddle through with some type of consultative intra-party democracy. Right? And China itself put out numerous books and articles saying this was going to be the case. Here are two of them. Right? Again, they're in English, so they're outward-facing, right? But the word democracy figures heavily, and the idea was that China would have an intra-party democracy, that the party would govern itself internally, checking itself. And the third, perhaps less popular view, but a view held by many, was that the CPC would fall. That through corruption and mismanagement, the CPC would simply not be able to hold together. And there were books put out, The Coming Collapse of China, and other things that suggested this view. But I would argue that none of these are right? And where we are isn't near really any of them. And that while all of these conclusions, these three, were things that we were very well, we were accepting. We could accept any one of these three scenarios that I put out there. The scenario that we've ended up with, which is a return to a chairman of everything, a one-man system where Chairman Xi is quoted 18 times before anything can be said, that has shocked us, and it has caused us to question our strategy and forced us to readjust it. And so we need to ask ourselves, how did this happen? How did we end up in a position where we all got it wrong? Not just one or two of us, but repeatedly, regularly, conference after conference, we got it wrong. And so let me put one culprit on the table. There are many culprits always. Whenever there's these kinds of crimes, there's conspiracies, but I would say there's one primary culprit, and that has been an over-reliance on international relations theory in general. I would say that IR theory has been unhelpful. It's even undermined our ability to understand China, because it has caused in us an obsession with major power politics. We are obsessed with great powers of the world and how they interact with each other, because IR theory is obsessed with it. And that has caused us to overlook what I would argue was China's strategy for the 21st century. And if you're curious whether or not this is China's strategy for the 21st century, I would suggest to you that the Chinese constitution has now been changed to include One Belt, One Road, which is essentially China's strategy for the 21st century, which is a strategy towards developing countries. One Belt, One Road is a purely developing country strategy, and that is part of China's constitution. That is something that President Xi has put forward in a big way and is fully supportive of. So Beijing got this one right, and we got it wrong. While Beijing is investing hugely in developing countries, we're calling them shitholes, right? And that, I think, helps to understand why their influence is where it is and where our influence is. So China has invested not only time, but human resources and money, a lot of effort militarily as well, and that is paying dividends. But I'm happy to say, though, that we didn't get everything wrong. And so 10 years ago, me and colleagues, some of which who are working on this book, put out this book, China in the Developing World, Beijing Strategy for the 21st Century. And you can see how much people cared about it because how much effort was put into the cover, right? Big deal. And so this is based on a set of hearings that I did when I was working with the U.S.-China Commission back in July of 2005. Right, so a long time ago now, right? That was 2 days of hearings that we did, and it kind of came together in 2007 with some of the people who were on that, put together this book. And so for the students in the room, hi guys, maybe I could give you one lesson from all of this kind of experience on these projects. And that would be that if you really want to get ahead of the curve on these issues, you cannot follow the herd. If you follow the herd, you will be behind the herd, hence following. So you need to do independent research, you need to listen to your advisors, you need to ignore the haters, and you need to follow your instincts, first and foremost. If you see something developing, you need to follow the leads. And given that the sinologists were primarily wrong on everything, you really can't do any worse than we've done. So the bar is low. So, getting to the book itself then, maybe 3 quick observations. First is that China is nearing the end of a transition from a developing country into a major power. But that transition and the resulting increasing asymmetries between China and other countries is a challenge to China in a lot of ways. It challenges the political line that they've had for a long time. And so while China, in interactions with the United States and at Davos, claims the mantle of great power status and of global leadership, just earlier this year, Ran Zhongzi, who is a scholar at the China Institute of International Relations, a think tank that is, I would say, a research institution, research arm of the Foreign Ministry of China, in the article he put out earlier this year, he said China's international status as the world's largest developing country has not changed. And so we have this dual messaging with China is both a great power or an emerging power or a major power. At the same time, China is still the world's largest developing country. And so one prediction I want to put out there is that I'm going to predict that this is going to lead to some challenges going forward, some changes in the way that China interacts with the developing world, and that China will be forced to alter its political approach, if it hasn't already begun to alter that political approach, to developing countries in ways that reflect its major power status. And that these claims that China is still a developing country to some degree fall on deaf ears in the developing world, and that strategy needs to be readjusted and is being readjusted to some degree. Secondly, my work in this book and in other projects suggests that it is China's internal political economy dynamics that are the primary determinant of its international behavior. Again, completely in contradiction to IR theory, which would say systematic discussions and issues on the system level determine primarily a state's behavior. I would say that's wrong in the case of China and help to cause our problems. So what we need to do is take more and better full account of what's going on domestically. And with that, we have to accept modesty, which is that our influence over China is extremely limited, that it always has been limited, and that Chinese friends who have told us that it's not limited are not necessarily giving us, in my opinion, a full story. Given our past performance in predicting future events in China, let alone influencing them, our goal going forward should be increased modesty with regard to our objectives when it comes to influencing the PRC's policies. I would also argue that the increasing prominence of united front and propaganda work in the Chinese foreign policy apparatus means that our influence will go down increasingly. Engagement with Chinese official entities, front groups, barbarian handlers, does not enhance US influence or understanding of China. Rather, it provides an opportunity for people to be propagandized. So we need to be very cognizant of the engagements we're having and what the outcomes can be. Under such conditions, then, it's best for foreign countries, developing countries, and the United States to engage China on their own terms and on a limited and select group of issues. Engagement should not be 1,000 flowers blooming at once. It should be 5 or 10 strong flowers, fragrant flowers. And if a flower goes bad, it should be plucked from the garden. Engagement should not be engagement for engagement's sake. Engagement should be a policy with a purpose. And if it's not achieving that purpose, it ought not be pursued. So we shouldn't over-engage China. We shouldn't not engage China, but we shouldn't over-engage China either. Both of these, I would say, are extreme positions. What we need to do is have some smart engagement, where we think about each engagement, where we build robust, long-term engagements that serve the people of both countries. We shouldn't conceive that every engagement is of equal value. Some engagements should be prioritized, others should be diminished, or even mothballed if necessary. And during Q&A, I hope we can discuss what we think those kinds of engagement might be, and hear from others on the panel about where we think we should, what kind of roses or tulips or what kind of garden we ought to have. And one word of concern, and this is just kind of concern from a foreigner looking out at China and saying, WTF. I watched portions of China's Spring Gala, where there were an Africa performance, which was deeply concerning to many, particularly in African and African-American communities, where you had a woman with a fake buttocks, in blackface, a black man dressed as a monkey. This is the most watched show in the world. It's highly vetted by Chinese authorities. And so I was really surprised that something like that could get through, that could slip through the censors and actually become something that would be publicized around the world. And so my concern is that may be symptomatic of a larger problem of groupthink that's growing within China right now. So Hu Jintao's administration had many faults. I'm not going to sit here and say Hu Jintao was just grand. That's not my point. But it was certainly a consultative process that he was managing. Right? He had a group of people. We can argue if those were the right people or corrupt people. Those arguments, I think, should be had. But there's no doubt that there were many voices that were being heard at the table. And so now that we have a more top-down approach, I'm concerned that there aren't enough different voices in the room. Or if those voices are there, that they're not really being able to influence the policy process. I've in my work on China, Africa, I've had a lot of interactions with Chinese diplomats working on Africa, and I can tell you they are real professionals. They're great. They would not have allowed this kind of thing to go forward had their voice been heard. And I can imagine some of these fine people cringing while watching something like that. And so my question is, how do people who know Africa best not get asked about something like that? So that kind of feeds my concern that there may be groupthink expanding out into other elements in the domestic politics that we as foreigners don't see, because it's not basically put forward in a public display like the gala was. So, as one Chinese student here at the university said to me the other day, quote, or something to this effect, it's not a quote, it's generally, we used to be free to say nothing, but now we have to be political. And I think this is kind of one of the things we overlook in the United States. The freedom to do nothing, to say nothing, to be apolitical, to not vote, just to basically say, I don't want to be part of that conversation. And I would say one of the things that concerns me and that I think is leading to more groupthink is the over-politicization of education, the over-politicization of analysis, that we need to fit our analysis to a specific set of conclusions and then do the research to prove it. And we know, happens in Washington all the time, it's not a Chinese-only problem, but that is not social science, it's not good work. If you are coming to your conclusions and then trying to justify them, it's likely that there's outside influence in your conclusions. And that's something that deeply concerns me. And so maybe I'll leave you with my mantra, if you will, is that a free and open China is a strong China. And that's what I believe the world needs and what the Chinese people need. And the more free and the more open China is, the better China will be, and the better partner China will be for the world, for developing countries, for the United States in general. And so those are just some kind of issues to put on the table. But I'm happy to talk about any of them in the book and everything else, so thanks.
Should I jump in?
Yeah, go ahead.
So, thank you for including me in this. I am an active duty Foreign Service officer. I'm a career diplomat, and I am currently employed by the U.S. Department of State. Now, I'm not here to represent the department about U.S.-China policy. I'm not working in that. I have not been in China for a year. I am not currently in U.S.-China policy. But what I am here to do is to offer some observations about, from my experience, really less as a policymaker and more as a practitioner and implementer of the policy, and someone who has lived in China on a couple of assignments. I served in China in the late 90s in Shenyang, and most recently in Beijing. So I want to offer a couple of observations from that practitioner standpoint, and particularly as they relate to the book. You know, in discussing Chairman Xi Jinping, over the past year, we really have seen a real focus in media and in the popular culture about Xi as the most powerful, quote, most powerful Chinese leader since Mao Zedong. And many of those conclusions have been drawn based on, for example, the inclusion of Xi Jinping's thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era, the inclusion of that language in the party constitution. And then, of course, most recently, the amendment of the state constitution, which has abolished the term limits on the presidency, thus allowing him to occupy the 3 positions, essentially for life, should he choose to do so. And I would say that these, in fact, are not unimportant factors. But I think that serious thinkers will know that there is much more to it than that. I mean, because if you look back to Roman times, Augustus didn't use the term emperor and didn't get caught up in the trappings of the language and the terms, but at the same time, we still look back to Augustus as really the first Roman Empire. So I think it goes beyond just the labels and just the terms and the terminology and the Constitution. I think that what is really significant is going to be his legacy and the extent to which Chairman Xi is or is not transformational. I would argue that the jury is still out. I think that if we look back to Deng Xiaoping, for example, Deng Xiaoping and Mao Zedong both certainly had absolutely transformational influence on China. Revolutionary certainly for Mao. When you look at Xi, you know, you look at his remarks at Davos, where he is, and the authors discuss this, Dr. Eisenman discusses this, where, you know, he presents himself as a global statesman, talking about globalism. And, you know, the question is, what does that really mean? Is that empty words? Are these engagements with the world, is this stepping out going to have a lasting influence? I think the importance of this book at this point really is to help us gain an understanding. It's a compendium of what these activities have been for China to step out onto that world stage. I think the next phase is really going to be the assessment of the success or the failure of that effort. And so my prediction is it's going to be mixed. 20 years from now, when we're sitting here again, and I'll be on my cane, we will be assessing what has the lasting impact been. Has this been an empty promise of engagement with the world, or has there been a transformational effect on the world? You know, are we going to see that there are really bitter lessons in the developing world of Chinese-built white elephants that are left to gather dust? Or are we going to see bitter lessons of a colonialism with Chinese characteristics? Or rather, are we going to see true development fostered by engagement with China, funding from China, and with local control, local characteristics, transparency, good governance? And I think that's going to really be one of the ways we make an assessment of the Xi Jinping legacy. Now, I think that in popular culture, in the media, in politics, there is a real tendency to want to either lionize or demonize a leader and a state. And I think, again, serious thinkers are going to realize that it's actually really much, much more complex than that. I think that the Chinese activities that are described and outlined in this book really are that. They are quite complex. You know, I completely agree with Dr. Eisenman that this is driven by this is domestically driven for China. That being said, though, there are real geostrategic and geopolitical implications of this stepping out into the world stage. You know, when you think about this infrastructure development and the engagement with the developing world, the U.S. position, the U.S. official position is infrastructure development is a good thing. That being said, it has to be paired with good governance. And it needs to come with rules of the law, rules of the road, and rule of law. At the Belt and Road Forum, which was the conference last May, I was charge d'affaires during that period of time, and I had the opportunity to join Matt Pottinger, the senior director for Asia from the National Security Council, who was representing the United States at the Belt and Road Forum. And I joined Matt for that event. And the messaging that we were carrying to participants in that conference really was a messaging about rules of the road, rules of governance, and transparency. Really promoting that in the bidding process for One Belt, One Road projects, there needed to be transparency so that there was a level playing field for companies to participate and to bid on these projects. That as projects were getting off the ground, there needed to be transparency to combat the potential for corruption. That local leaders need to be brought into these projects, given responsibility. There need to be regulations and rules set up surrounding these projects. We were not in support of Chinese-built, Chinese-financed projects in a place where then China owns the road. And you know, to going into a foreign country, building this infrastructure, and then China owning it. That was not the U.S. official position, and that's not what we were supporting. So that's really what we were looking at when we were looking at One Belt, One Road, and that is the U.S. position on One Belt, One Road. I would say just as the reality of these projects is complex, I think it's also fair to say that the reality of U.S.-China relations is quite complex. And again, there's this popular tendency to want to lionize or demonize, to think in black and white. And the reality is, it's not black and white. We have huge areas where we have significant collaboration with China because our interests align. We are doing extensive research into tuberculosis treatment and care in a project in central China. The United States U.S. Agency for International Development is engaged with China to do a joint development project to create a Center for Disease Control in Africa, and we are working jointly with them on that project. It's also fair to say that there are other areas, obviously, where our interests do not align and where there is where there's conflict. But my point is that it's incredibly complex, and I think that this book really does help lead. It lends depth and breadth to our understanding of China and what China's role in the world is now. And I think that I would really look forward to a third book 10, 15, 20 years from now of assessing what that legacy is. And I think that I had something else to say, but I forgot what it was, so I'm going to just stop there. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Josh, for inviting me to participate in this panel discussing your book. And first of all, thanks for the book that you gave me a couple of weeks ago. But I didn't have a chance to read it until last night. And I spent a couple of hours on this book. I was so impressed by the quality of the volume. Admittedly, we have a stereotype on edited volumes, and yes, there are lots of volumes that put together wonderful essays and made tremendous contribution to different fields. But there are also many edited volumes that are put together, different articles without a coherent theme, and the qualities of the chapters are very different. And sometimes we're just disappointed by such edited volumes. But yours is very different. Yeah, I was so impressed by how well organized the chapters are, and how a coherent theme dominate the entire volume. And most important, I guess you and your co-authors offer a balanced view about China's engagement with the developing countries. I made some quick notes here. For example, overall you argue that China's engagement with developing countries is successful. It made huge investments in different parts of the world, and they serve the government, Chinese government's objectives very well. But on the other hand, you suggest that there are also lots of risks that associate with China's going abroad project, especially in some developing countries that has lots of political instability, corruption, or any other problems that would undermine the effectiveness of China's investments in those countries, right? This is one point I got from your book. And then the second is that in terms of China's attitudes towards the existing international order, overall China is supportive of it. China works with other major powers, and China participates in all those major financial institutions and even security arrangements. But on the other hand, China tried to modify those institutions to serve its purposes better than existing ones. And third, you also argue that China's investment in developing countries, ranging from Africa to Southeast Asia, South Asia, Latin America, they made contributions to local economic growth. But at the same time, those projects also have some side effects. They undermine the capacities of indigenous manufacturing industries. So there are both positive and negative effects. And finally, you talking about China's relationship with the United States. And yes, as Julie just mentioned, these two powers have lots of areas where their interests overlap. They collaborate on different fronts. But on the other hand, they have confrontations, even if not conflicts. But one of the obvious example is China's island building in South China Sea. That's perceived as a challenge to the security and interests of the neighboring countries. So I guess overall, this chapter offers a comprehensive and a well-balanced and nuanced interpretation of China's relations with all those developing countries in different areas. So organized in this book, I had a feeling that it's not just an ordinary collection of essays on China's engagement with developing countries. It could serve as a very good reference book. It covers different aspects of China's relationship with all those developing countries in different areas. So organized, so comprehensive. I guess this is a rare example how edited volumes could bring huge contributions to our scholarship. And that said, I do have some comments on this book. One obvious thing, as I just mentioned to you early on, is that yes, you cover all these major areas of the developing world, but there are two countries that are missing from your picture. One is North Korea. It's such an important country or ally to China, and the other is Mongolia. I guess if you cover Northeast Asia as well, that would make this book more complete. And I guess the other thing that I would expect more discussion from your book is you just mentioned that yes, China's global strategy or China's interaction with the developing world was ultimately driven by China's domestic political economic dynamics. I completely agree with it. But what exactly is that dynamic? What exactly is that dynamic? I'm thinking about the same question as well. And actually, I'm working on a paper on this subject, but I disagree with the interpretations by many Chinese or Western economists who just explain China's rise as a major economic power by focusing exclusively on economic factors, such as the dismantling of the collective system in agriculture that offers strong incentives for farmers to maximize their labor input and output, right? Such as China's reform measures to marketize its economy and to open up the entire country to the Western world, so that foreign investment came to China and China expanded its foreign trade. And yes, all these factors contribute hugely to China's economic growth. But if we look at other parts of the world, family farming, which was a result of agricultural reform, exists everywhere in the world. It exists in China before 1949. But it does not bring prosperity in different parts of the world, in the rural area. And a market economy is found everywhere in the world. And in China, it's just a transition from a plain economy to a market economy. But that transition, explains China's economic growth, for a certain period of time. But it cannot explain why China's economy has kept growing so fast and for so long period of time. So what exactly are the factors driving China's economic growth? And or in your words, what's exactly the dynamic behind China's rise as a major economic power? I guess this is not an occasion for me to explain my own arguments, but we can look at this issue from a historical perspective. And I guess lots of people here know that we have different theories to explain the long-term economic growth from a worldwide or global perspective. One of them, for example, is the world system theory, right? That offered by Emmanuel Wallenstein, who suggests that the entire world could be divided into 3 different categories: the core countries, all those industrial nations in Europe, North America, including Japan, and then periphery, mostly developing countries, and a third group of economies in between them, which is termed as the semi-peripheral or semi-cores. So I guess China today is in a transition. For years, it was part of the semi-peripheral zone of the global economy, right? It has a degree of industrialization, but it's not the industrial nation yet. And it's in a transition from a semi-peripheral to core country in global perspective. And I agree to some degree with your point that yes, China has moved to the point of completion of its transition from a developing country to a mature developing economy. But I'm not really that optimistic. But nevertheless, I guess China is not an ordinary economy. There have been some examples of modernization with the success, such as Japan, such as South Korea, such as Taiwan. But all these nations are small in scale. Japan has a population of 100 million. And South Korea has a population of just 50 or 60 million. And Taiwan even smaller. None of them are comparable to China in size. China has a population of 1.4 billion. So that's not just about the demographic size. It also means a huge market and a huge capacities in manufacturing. So China's transition from an industrial nation, industrializing nation, to industrial nation will have a huge impact on global economy and on international order than any other preceding examples of successful modernizers or industrial nations. But what exactly is the scale of China's impact on the rest of the world? We just see some effects emerging nowadays in the past few years. My impression is that in every area, when Chinese industry enters that realm, with its massive capacity of scale production, with its ability to bring the price dramatically down to a level unimaginable before, then the entire world market would be changing. There are lots of examples, such as LCD monitors, such as telecommunication equipment, such as computer chips, and so on. So you can imagine when China finished the transition to industrial nation, what the effect would be. And so let's now move to the subject of your book. China's engagement with the developing world. What exactly is the effects or the results of China's investment in these countries? And I got a feeling from the chapters that so far, all those initiatives have served China's the purposes of Chinese government well, and they also brought tremendous benefits to the local economy. But in the long run, I doubt if that will be the picture to continue. China, as I just said, China industry was so huge, and it has been so competitive. There are lots of hundreds or even thousands of industrial clusters in different parts of China, and those clusters encompass hundreds of thousands of factories. They each produce a specific part, for an entire product that bring their the cost to an extremely low level. It's not just because of the cheap labor of Chinese manufacturing sector. It's because of the existence of this large number of clusters that make their production extremely efficient. So with that picture in mind, I often ask myself a question: would there any chance for other countries, most of those developing countries, to have a chance to industrialize? I doubt. As long as they are integrated with global economy, they open their door out to China's exports. The chances are very slim. You look at many other, not only in this country, all other developing countries, China's products flag their market in every corner, in every field. So I guess in the long run, I'm not really that positive on China's engagement in developing world, especially from the perspective of the development of the indigenous industries. And even the U.S.-China relationship. So far, I guess, as you suggest, it's not really that sort of a zero-sum game. China's investment in developing countries have different fields, from those investments made by the U.S. or other industrial nations. But again, if we have that picture of China's long-term industrialization or its long-term national competitive advantage in mind, I guess that picture of collaboration or mutual supplement in economic cooperation is not really that optimistic. Let me stop.
So trade issues, right? Look at the cover, right? So maybe let's open it up to question and answer, and I'm sure there's plenty of. So I'm going to go to a student here first.
I'll stand. So I'm Clements Hewitt. I'm a student here at LBJ and over at the law school, and I actually just got back from China with a McCombs trip, and I was going to ask a two-part question about Belt and Road. So the first part has to do with financing. So I think a lot of the intended, not consequences, but the intended ambitions for Belt and Road have to do with an underlying assumption that it will be financed with Chinese money, and that has sort of run into problems of late, the more of a bubble that has been created in China. So now we're seeing like Japan is footing a lot of the bill, and that came out in like December. So how do you think external financing for Chinese-led projects is going to like change the way Beijing thinks about Belt and Road? And the second part of that question is when I actually got to talk to a consulting firm called Strategy and they talked about how there's this really strange balance struck between international posturing with Belt and Road, which is the nationalistic message that comes with it, Chinese leadership, and then just domestic concern for unloading overcapacity for production. So how do you think that balance is, and where do you think the true value of Belt and Road is for Beijing, rather than just like a Western understanding of it?
Well, you were at the forum, so.
Well, I think that even before we saw this, when you talk about financing, this isn't going to directly answer your question, but one of the things that we were seeing even, a year ago, 2 years ago, was there was a political directive to the various financial institutions in China to finance these projects. And yet these financial institutions are still held to the need to make good loans. It's not, they're not using standards to go out and make bad loans. There's a political imperative to make loans, but they were already a year, 2 years ago, finding it very, very challenging to find good projects where they could invest money and they're going to actually make a good loan and get that money back. I think that that's a very interesting phenomenon, and it makes you really, it suggests anyway that this is really a politically driven project, not in fact a financial or an economic project. It is a political project. I'm sorry, I don't remember what the rest of your question was. So that's just the observation that I would make.
Well, great. Well, let me jump off that and let me see, this issue of financing is really important. And there's been a lot of reporting on One Belt, One Road, and it seems to mistake different types of financing, right? So anybody watch Shark Tank, right? And what is Mr. Wonderful's move? The loan, right? Debt financing. But there's a big difference between debt and equity, right? If you do equity, that means you're an owner, part owner in the company. And if you do debt, that means you need from the owner repayment. And so I think that we need to be very specific in the terms we use when we talk of financing. Because One Belt, One Road is overwhelming, 90-something% debt-driven, okay? And this is a fundamentally different approach than the rest of Chinese history through the tributary system, when you got your silk and jade, but you didn't have to pay it back. Right? You come to the emperor, you do your kowtows, you get your silk and jade, you go home. It's a gift. But a loan has this kind of long-term relationship. And anybody who's ever lent money to a friend or borrowed money from a friend, it has a pretty deleterious effect on relationships over time. And so
How many people do you owe?
Citibank primarily, and they ain't my friend. But and it's also usually the case that when people are granted a loan, they're there and happy and dressed like me. But when repayment comes, it can be harder to find them. So looking at the forum that you attended, I consider this not the handing out ceremony, but the we want to be on the list ceremony. And of course, everyone's going to show up for that. But if you had the One Belt, One Road repayment forum, you may not have as many people who show up. So I think that the issue of how we talk about financing is important. And getting specifically to Julie's point a moment ago, in doing some interviews I've done with Ambassador Shin for another book we're working on, China-Africa relations, we met with people at the China-Africa Development Fund. And the Development Fund is an equity investor right? So they've been granted a certain amount of money from the China Development Bank, and their goal is to go out into Africa and find equity investments that are going to be profitable. They have this political push and these monies to do so. And even with 2 floors of analysts looking all around Africa all the time, they still couldn't lend out all the money that they had, which was about $10 billion. And of the money they'd lent out, which was about 6 or 7, the return rate was not as high as they had expected, all right, in terms of the success of those investments. And so that speaks to the issue you're talking about, Julie, right? That Chinese people are all about investing abroad, but in New York real estate, in safe investments where they can't go to zero, or it's unlikely they would be. So it's easy to get Chinese people of wealth to invest it in places where they think they're going to get a return. But when you try to get them to invest in places that are highly corrupt, already indebted or bad histories of repayment, of course they're not lining up. And we shouldn't be surprised. They don't want to lose money. So it's not surprising that you have a politically driven push, because if you don't, you're not going to have any there then. And one of the kind of symptoms, and this goes to your second question about Belt and Road's true value, is that my understanding is that a large percentage, if not the majority of Belt and Road projects to this point have been domestic within China. If we look at the picture, the map of One Belt, One Road, you've got this big international component which gets all the media attention, and then this domestic component which goes all the way to, well, it depends on who you talk to. Right? If you talk to people in Hunan, it goes to Hunan. People in Fujian, it goes to Fujian. Talk to people in Heilongjiang, it goes to Heilongjiang. Right? So, right? You go with the wind. Right? The wind says that this is the way to relieve yourself of some debt. Right? Maybe you're an over-debted locality, and you can't. No longer debt-driven growth is possible. So you use One Belt, One Road resources to build the train station you wanted, or to do something that you had already kind of run out of funding for. And so the One Belt, One Road is not only an international project, it's a very domestic one. And so the deployment of overcapacity, again, is both an international and domestic issue. But I think that a lot of media attention has been placed on the external component of it, and that we would do well to look more about the domestic component and understand how it is in fact bailing out localities which had been basically told this is the end. Well, now they've got a new lease on life, and again, more debt-driven growth. I think maybe that, and maybe one quick point at the end would be this strategy of lending lots of money to Chinese state-run enterprises, letting them spend that money and then wiping the debt clean and lending them more money. That can kind of work if you are the Chinese government and you own both the enterprise and the bank. You're kind of handing from one hand to the other, and then another hand. But if you're doing this externally, in 60-something different countries with different laws and different cultures and different on-the-ground politics, as Huaiyin said a moment ago, well, now your risk portfolio is just kind of all over the place. And it becomes very difficult in a political atmosphere where you're being told to do this, and no is not a reasonable answer to give, that there's going to be some mistakes. And so I support Huaiyin's points a moment ago that there's reason not to be optimistic if we do come back here. So this was the beginning. This is the middle, right? And then we have to come back 10 years later, 20 years later, and then say, well, what's the end, right? And of course, there's never an end, but how successful has this approach been?
The issue of whether she is going to be transformational has been raised. How do you assess the risk of whether he can really endure over the long term if, for example, two hypotheticals could exist? If the economy goes down and it's his governance and he's going to have to take the blame, or he has a health problem, is it more likely that another strong military leader will emerge versus whether the country will boomerang to the collective leadership that has characterized the last 25 to 30 years?
Who wants to be the soothsayer?
I think that's the million-dollar question, right? That's my answer.
Huaiyin, do you want to? Okay, maybe I'll take the bait because we got to give you some kind of answer over here. Okay, so setting aside the health issues, right? Now, I can't predict the health of Xi Jinping. That would be, I can't. But Economically, Xi Jinping has from the beginning talked about a new normal. So he's setting expectations. For those of you who study economics, expectations are an important determinant, right? And so he's setting expectations at a lower level. He's already coming in and saying, don't expect 7% growth. It ain't gonna happen, right? He's getting people ready to accept, if not already accepting, a lower growth rate. And that's a lot of it, actually, getting people to accept that. But I would also say that he's also more than doubled down on the security apparatus. And that means that even if people are unhappy, even if that the economic situation isn't perfect, when you're kind of referring to what I like to call the Deng deal, the Deng Xiaoping deal, right? Give us the political power and we'll make your life better. And that was the kind of arrangement that many have talked about for decades. But I think that deal is kind of frayed for the reasons you're suggesting. And so at this point, it seems the security state, whether it be facial recognition software or other kinds of Orwellian techniques, are going to make it almost impossible for disgruntled people to come together and have any kind of collective action against the government. So you haven't asked me this, but let me say this. I don't know about Xi Jinping and how long he'll live, but I'll say that I believe the Communist Party of China's rule over China will certainly outlive me. For whatever reason, we can talk more about the reasons, but I'm certainly not, and have never been of the camp of believing that the Communist Party is crumbling and falling and withering away. And it seems to me that Xi Jinping's efforts at anti-corruption, if they've done nothing else, they have consolidated the party's rule. So.
Well, and if you look at, the recent events of moving many of the media and the educational texts and all of that back under the censors, that is a move to further consolidate that security state. And I think that, I served in Moscow for 2 years before going to Beijing. And I think that both Putin and Xi sort of have learned some lessons from history. And they are afraid of color revolution. They learned from Gorbachev, they learned from the Orange Revolution, and they are making moves and have made moves to make sure that that doesn't happen to them. And I think we all should learn from history, and I believe that they most certainly have, and that they're taking steps to do that. That being said, though, one of the reasons that Deng Xiaoping moved in the direction that he did was to avoid the chaos of a transition. And so he designated Hu quite early, and it was very evident that there was a succession, and it was to avoid the chaos of transition. And we're not seeing that now. In fact, it's precisely the opposite. So again, I would go back and say that is still the million-dollar question. But I do agree that he has made moves to sort of consolidate the power of the party, and is trying to he's trying to hedge his bets. He's trying to do both, be the supreme leader, but at the same time hedge the bets for the party.
One last point on this that's particularly, if you're not concerned, let me help you be a little concerned. So Mao Zedong had a Deng Xiaoping, right? A very senior person who was well respected in the party, who was a veteran, who had just influence everywhere, and in a lot of ways he never got rid of Deng Xiaoping because he himself even recognized Deng Xiaoping was a really important and valuable person, even if he didn't agree with him. Go down to the tractor factory, leave me alone. But he didn't do what he did to Liu Shaoqi did, Deng Xiaoping. And so one thing that it was really bad to be in Chinese history was Mao Zedong's successor. That didn't work out very well for anybody, whoever really was. And the person who ended up being Mao's true successor, a guy named Hua Guofeng, there's a reason to believe that his failure wasn't really of his own. It was because he never had a political base, because he was never allowed to build one. And then Deng Xiaoping comes in and basically has the base of the party behind him. And so Hua Guofeng really never had a chance, I would argue, and Huaiyin probably has different views, or I'm curious his views on this. We don't have to go down this road. This is for another book. But the issue is that we don't have a chosen successor of Xi Jinping at all. But we certainly don't have a Deng Xiaoping. So the problem is that Deng Xiaoping kind of stopped that process, put in certain checks to make sure it was, as Julie talked about. But without that kind of figure, if something were to happen to Xi Jinping, who is as human as us all, it would be really unclear and I think pretty chaotic in terms of how things would move in the immediate term.
Yeah, let me add by mentioning another fact that confronts the Chinese government and may shape its economic and political strategies. That's a debate on whether or not China has entered a middle income trap. This is a situation experienced by a lot of developing countries. They have undergone a degree of industrialization, and the living standards of their peoples have reached a certain level, such as anywhere from, let's say, $3,000 US per capita to as high as $7,000 or $8,000 per capita. But after they reach that level, they will stay there for decades, and they will see, all kinds of fluctuations in economic growth, political instabilities, and a worsened dependence on multinational corporations. And I guess to some degree, yes, you will find signs of a middle income trap emerging in China, and that's exactly what concerns the Chinese leadership. How can we make sure that our industry will continue to grow autonomously without excessive dependence on multinational corporations, and how should we develop our economy without being constrained by those invest interests, not to let those very powerful and very rich to manipulate and dominate our economic policies, and not to mention the issue of corruption. So I guess if we have all those factors in a picture, you will find that some of the initiatives proposed by Xi Jinping, yes, they served his personal selfish agenda of strengthening his control of the government, perpetuating his power as the top leader. But I guess there is also the other side of the picture, which are the lots of problems that come from the Chinese government. So how to solve those problems, and how to make sure China will be able to avoid or to get rid of that emerging middle income trap. That's a huge issue. I guess when you put together these two sides of the picture, you have a more balanced understanding of what he is trying to do.
The political economy, right? I mean, that you can't really pull these things apart. I think it's an important point.
Yeah, you mentioned that some of the experiences that China has had with developing countries has not been as successful as they were expected. You mentioned the case of Africa, and you mentioned the case of Venezuela, which I've seen with I believe there in that situation in China invested $50 billion or something like that to secure more oil supplies, and now it has a government that depends on whether China can give financial support to the government so it can survive. So I wanted to ask you, have these cases affected or changed the way the Chinese leadership manages or sees these kind of interventions? Have they learned anything from these kind of less successes or failures? And could that lead to some maybe thorny issues about increasing accountability or transparency in the handling of these involvement and projects?
So you're from Venezuela,
Yeah.
right? So this is a very good question. Buying time here. So yes, Venezuela's not the only one. Sri Lanka and other places. China's run into problems, and as Julie said in her remarks, we shouldn't expect 100% success, right? Nobody's right 100% of the time, so we should expect to see some failures. And so the critical question is not, are there any failures? Does that, portend a grand failure, right? Does a couple of failures now suggest that we may have a grand failure? Because, especially when you're lending to high-risk places, they're high reward to some degree, but they're also going to be high risk by definition, and so you're going to have to accept it, right? That some things aren't going to work. And so the question is, are these harbingers, right? The horsemen. And that if you don't take full acknowledgement of that, then you're bound to repeat it again and again and again. I can tell you that in talking to people at the NDRC, about these issues, there's a lot of internal memos about this going on, right? When I laid out my set of concerns about One Belt, One Road, the person I was talking to's response was, "You're being too optimistic." So that says a lot right there, right? But that also means that there are people inside the system who are looking at these issues, right? That are writing about these issues, people of influence. Now, I can't tell you who's, if the Politburo Standing Committee is reading the memos, but I can tell you that there are, this is not something the Chinese side has not fully acknowledged and isn't grappling with. And then the question is, well, what do you do when you've got a politically driven policy that needs to be successful in light of these cases? And so I think that's really where the answer is to your question that I can't give, which is what policy adjustments are taking place to mitigate those kinds of risks. And I'm not sure we know at this point, or that it's not necessarily even possible to go into the leadership and tell them at this point that these are really, really big problems that portend other issues, right? So you've asked exactly the right question, and but maybe I'll leave you with this idea, that the tipping point is going to come if these things begin to kind of spiral, right? When you've got a moral hazard problem where country after country is coming to Beijing asking to renegotiate the loan. Oh, and you gave so-and-so the loan, and what about me? I want the same rate. And we've seen a little bit of this. In fact, some Chinese scholars have said the biggest problem with One Belt, One Road is that we're giving good deals and people want even better deals, right? Right? Concession isn't concessional enough. But you're also suggesting something that's been, increasingly attention of people who follow development, which is, are we getting ready for another landslide of debt crises? At this point, working at numbers that are beyond the IMF's ability to bail out. And of course, the Chinese strategy has long been to say that Western institutions are not part of what we're doing anyway. So we're working without a net at this point in terms of the size of what's going on. And if it's successful, it'll be grand success. And if it fails, it may well be grand failure. And have very important political ramifications for China domestically, right? Because whose neck are you going to hang this one around if it doesn't work? And I don't think there is one, right? This is a personal policy.
Yes, you had made the point that engaging with the international system, China is not intent on disrupting it or challenging it, but molding the rules to its own benefit. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, a major initiative of the United States with joining 12 countries to essentially set the rules for trade in Asia along the Pacific Rim. It was often described less as a trade deal and more as a geopolitical initiative. To what extent the United States pulling out of that engagement has opened the door for China to be more successful in molding the rules of the game to its own advantage?
Okay. So this is a refrain that I have heard numerous times with Chinese interlocutors, that there is U.S. manipulation of smaller countries to the detriment of China, right? That these smaller nations are being led in a way which is harmful to China by the United States. And what we've seen is that when the U.S. pulled out of TPP, they went forward anyway, right? They signed the deal, what was it, last week or something? So the nations who are part of TPP, I mean, I don't want to speak for them, but it seems that they said, okay, well, the U.S. isn't going to be in it. We'll leave a space, we'll leave a seat at the table for you, right? We'll make sure that there's a played out, and you guys can come along and join when you are ready, if you're ever ready. But I think the Chinese friends in Beijing should take good recognition of that the U.S. non-presence did not stop TPP from going forward. It went forward despite the fact that the U.S. pulled out. And that these countries are moving forward with a trade agenda, largely in response to what they see as Chinese mercantilist trade policies, as we are here in the United States in a unilateral way. And I think that should be a real signal to Beijing that if you're deluding yourself into believing that the United States is manipulating these smaller countries, in a way you're disrespecting these smaller countries that they don't know where they're going and they don't understand their own interests. But you're also asserting that the US has, I think, far more power than we really do over sovereign nations. So getting to the specific question you asked, will China be able to write the rules? It seems these countries have gotten together and said no by joining forward and moving forward the agreement. Had the whole thing fallen apart, I think that would have been a strong indication that maybe the US was the kind of driver and manipulator. And I also think the way that this was pitched in the United States was bad. It was pitched, as you rightfully point out, as a geopolitical must. Right? Pay no attention to the actual deals. It's all about geopolitics and us writing the rules and not China. I think that was a mistake politically to pitch it that way. This is a really complicated set of agreements, and maybe that was hard to pitch politically in the United States. But by pitching it as an anti-China initiative, that really fed the beast in Beijing, which said, aha, it is an anti-China initiative. You're saying it is, so it must be. Whereas I think that that was, in a lot of ways, a political maneuver to get people on board in the United States, and that the TPP was a much more important economic agreement that has been recognized because of the over-politicization of the issue and the so-called anti-China elements that have been added to it. So I hope that.
Well, yeah, I just like to add by saying that there are always two factors to shape a nation's global strategy. One is a geopolitical factor. Every country wants to maximize its advantage by building security ties with neighboring countries or with other powers. And then the other is an economic factor. You want to advance your advantages in foreign trade to maximize the profit from that deal. And for China, I guess these two factors alternate in the past. Sometimes the geopolitical factor predominates, and other times the economic factor prevails. So in the Mao era, as your book mentions, that China engaged in African countries primarily out of a geopolitical reason to win support from African countries in its attempt to enter the United Nations or on other fronts. And since the 1980s, China switched from that geopolitical factor to increasingly an economic factor. So, talking about the One Belt, One Road initiative, I guess it serves the two factors simultaneously. On the one hand, China went to increase its influences in the developing countries to build its image as an emerging power, and in turn, to enhance the leadership of the Communist Party. And on the other hand, it used that as a perfect way to solve the problem of the huge surplus of industrial capacities within China. And for China's neighbors, I guess again these two factors matter as well. Some of them join the TPP and avoid to reach agreement for free trade zones such as South Korea, Japan. They have been in years to discuss the possibility of forming a Northeast Asian free trade zone among China, South Korea, and Japan. That would be one of the largest. But nevertheless, they have to refrain from that move and accept the proposition of creating a TPP under the U.S. leadership. But now, I guess that's a different thing. So even for the Southeastern Asian neighbors, I guess yes, they had the powers to join the U.S. To form an anti-China coalition to some degree. But on the other hand, they have to be pragmatic. After all, China is such a huge economy. All those countries have such a huge amount of foreign trade with China. So economic factors matters to them as well. So I guess in the end, it's the interaction and a balance achieved between the two factors that ultimately shape their strategies towards China and towards the United States.
Maybe, is there a student here that has a question? I want to make sure we get a student question if any students have questions. All right, this gentleman here. And actually, you know what, we've got two. Why don't we take both questions and we can pick and choose from them. This will be, I think it's time. Right? So this will be our last two questions, and we'll try to keep our answers short. So, yeah.
Given that analysis of China's economic move, what is China thinking with respect to the move into the South China Sea, and how does that impact on its neighbors, including Indonesia, India, etc.? How does that play into this analysis?
And this young lady over here.
So thank you so much for this fascinating kind of discussion. We learned a lot. So I have a question. I heard the term history several times, especially phrases like the tributary system. So I wonder if we take into account the imperial history that China had, especially the last dynasty, the Qing dynasty, the Canton system. So I wonder if, to what extent you think that it's possible for China to step out, not just to step out into the world stage, but also step out and establish a Chinese world order. So not just to, to modify those rules, but also attempt to build its own dominance in the international stage. Thank you.
You want to do either one of these?
Well, I think if you look at the South China Sea, China has increasingly labeled the South China Sea as one of its core interests. Core interests being South China Sea, Taiwan, and Tibet. And these are areas of geostrategic importance to China where they have established certain red lines that they have stated that they're going to maintain. I think one of the things, if you look at China, in periods when the economic environment starts to deteriorate, I haven't done any data analysis, so I'm looking at this from the perspective of just what my impressions are. It'd be interesting to know what the historical record actually shows, but my impression is that when the economy starts to go down, or there are dangers of social unrest, there is a turn to raising nationalist issues with the intent of perhaps distracting the political discourse and generating a certain amount of nationalism, and thereby generating support for the party, support for the leadership, consolidating their position. Again, I haven't done a survey of the data and looking at all of the incidents, but that certainly is my impression, and my observation would be that the military buildup, the land reclamation in South China Sea really is part of this consolidation of the party's position, because it is representing it's drawing on nationalism, representing a strong communist party that, while there may be some shaky things going on in the economy, we've got the South China Sea and we have established our predominance there. So I think that really is what it's about. It's about that nationalism.
I'd like to say a few words on the questions that are raised. I guess that the system of nation states or sovereign states is an invention of the Europeans back in the 16th and the 17th centuries, and now they dominate the world. But in Chinese history, there was not such a concept of sovereignty or sovereign states. For the rulers and ordinary subjects, there are just two things. One is a regime or a dynasty, and the other is the world or all under the heaven. They don't have the idea of a national boundary or sovereignty of the nation. Not at all. And even in the era of Mao, from the 50s to 60s, that European notion of nation state does not really apply to the Chinese government. Mao deal with North Korea, with Vietnam and Burma, in different ways. Sometimes he could, freely give up, China's land to the neighboring countries upon their request. So what exactly will China be in the future? I would say that nations, the system of nation states will continue, for decades or even for centuries or even more. But would that be the only form of international relations to shape China's global strategy? I doubt. As China's economy expanded, its trade relations spread to different parts of the world, it has to redefine its role, as a sovereign state or as something else. I guess it's hard to predict, but I guess in the decades to come, there will be some interesting changes. That's the basic.
Very, quickly, because our time is up, but I agree with, Julie's position on the South China Sea, but I want to put a little blame on the table. I do believe the Obama administration has a lot to answer for here. I really do. They stood back and did nothing and allowed this all to happen. Their weakness is part responsible for this. So while I don't believe that we have much influence in determining Chinese internal politics and their internal policies, it's externally where I think we do have some influence, and we clearly did not do our jobs on this. And Julie probably can't speak to the issue very directly, but I do think that there is some blame to go around here. And if you all want to talk to me offline, I'll tell you names of people. We can speak. So on the history question, this is somewhat concerning, right? Is China trying to create a kind of neo-imperial, not neo-imperialist, but neo-imperial kind of tributary relationship with loans instead? I've seen some evidence of that, and certainly there are some kind of reflections of that that are concerning. I would argue that Derek Mitchell's chapter in the book, which is about the history issue specifically and how history helps to influence, I would commend that chapter for you. I think it's extremely well done. Derek Mitchell, who I think you probably know, was U.S. ambassador to Myanmar, which is why he didn't co-edit this book. But after he left, he was able to update his chapter. But I do think that China does face a question of kind of overextension if it does try to get so deeply involved externally at the expense of internal affairs. And I would argue that that might be the only thing that could possibly threaten the stability of the regime. If you did have a collapse of One Belt, One Road, if you did have mass countries coming to renegotiate, if you ended up with a financial crisis which spiraled, that could be maybe the only threat. So I would suggest that China should be very risk averse, which is not what it has been, but increasingly risk averse on this issue. So thanks, guys. Thanks all for coming.